concerns about it, everybody has the right to let me know. So,
okay, fair enough.
okay. All right. So it's 6 o'clock, and I'm going to go ahead and get us rolling then. This is our last Theory of Knowledge meeting of the season, because we're going to take a little break for a little while and get resettled. And I couldn't be more excited. This is a perfect finale for me. So for John to come and share his wisdom with us today. So let me tell you a little bit about my frame on John and what he means to me. I really see John as a modern day hero of the academy. And I use that in a reference, of course, to John as a Neoplatonic visionary and scholar. Let me tell you a little bit about why I say that. And I don't say that lightly. I can't say that I've seen that frame be applied to too many people. I think the academy, as really the current state, is certainly in the midst of a major crisis. I felt that for a long time in relationship to what the academy was trying to do. It seemed to me to be sort of a landscape of chaotic, fragmented pluralism that didn't appreciate its proper role in relation to the times. It didn't appreciate its proper mission and vision. It didn't have an idea for creating a space in which we could both honor knowledge and cultivate wisdom. And then I look out at John's life. I look out at his journey for making meaning out of this life, how he transformed his own early struggles, which he's talked about in terms of the community he was socialized into, wrestled with that with honor and integrity, explored the possible meaning-making systems, entered into a number of different communities, became super well-versed in Eastern thinking, bridged Western philosophy, bridged Western science, and then emerged onto the scene, I think, in a way that certainly I encountered him through what he's now most famous for, which is the awakening from the meaning crisis, which I really do believe is arguably the most impactful course that I have taken. I encountered John through the Emerge podcast world. I listened to him, heard about the meaning crisis, and took it. And as I confessed to him, as soon as I started to absorb it, I doubled my walks so that I could accelerate through it. What John does in that series and what he embodies in his life is exactly the antidote to the crisis of the academy. It fundamentally represents a tackling of knowledge, and at its heart, at the core of what it represents in terms of the chaotic, fragmented pluralism, along the deepest questions of matter and mind, science and society, and then does so in relationship to speak to the deepest concerns we face, and then to channel those into what is the kind of practices and ecologies and ways of being that is so desperately needed in this time between worlds. And not only that, as he connects to other people, he is transforming and generating an emergent practice of dialogos, which is in the best Socratic tradition. And I have been honored and thrilled to connect with John and contribute my part to that journey. And John, just thank you so much for all that you do, friend.
Thank you, Gregg. Like, that. Thank you. The fact that it came from you means a lot to me. I said this at the end of we will release next Friday, our final episode together of Untangling the Worldknot. I mean, I've just been astonished by Gregg and his work, and and he saw things about the connection between his work and my work that have turned out to ground and afford an ongoing, very productive and creative cooperative dialogue between us that I thoroughly and deeply enjoy. I like hanging out with Gregg and his mind. It sounds like there's two people, and and as we made our way through, I mean, we had some conversations, and I started to get a sense of what was going on. I started to get like he's bloody Aristotle, and I'm getting this sense, and then I like I said, I wanted to do the work on on consciousness in a dialogical fashion, and Gregg turned out to be the perfect partner for that. And I've just been, and my appreciation for his participation and contribution and friendship throughout that just grew and grew. So much so that I want Gregg and I and another person you might have heard of, Christopher Mastropietro, to work together to do something similar on the nature and function of the self. So, you know, people are much more revealing by their deeds than by their words. And so the fact that I want to continually include Gregg in the development and promotion of my own work, which is dear to me, indicates how dear he has become to me. And so I'm very, very grateful to be here, and to participate in Gregg's community. So when he asked me to do this, I said, sure, of course.
Amen, friend. Thank you so much. I am, you know, it's been a great journey on consciousness, and I'm looking forward to the self.
Yeah, it'd be a lot of fun. It should be a lot of fun. I mean, like, especially some of the insights that that co-emerged, right? That was really, really wonderful. Really wonderful.
Definitely. Super cool. So speaking of the self, John, I think the folks here would love to hear a little bit of your narrative about, you know, how did you, you can start anywhere, but I think you know, sort of your journey to the awakening, and then your journey since the awakening in terms of the remarkable impact. Those are two sort of phases that perhaps.
Yeah, it's feeling like the before the Common Era and Common Era division for me. I hope that's not sacrilegious, because
John, it's the birth of the new axial age is going to be dated to.
I'm just talking about my own personal experience. I don't, because there's this weird thing. I'm socially phobic by nature, and so when I started doing, so I became a teacher, of course. And so when I started doing this series, I was experiencing sort of a profound exposure, and then I got sort of used to that. It was waking me up in the middle of the night for quite a while, but then as things sort of settled in, and I accommodated as human beings are wont to do, a second thing started happening, which is this entity, John Vervaeke, started emerging that felt like something somewhat separate from me as I live my life. It comes out in really, because when I meet people now, they often act as if they know me really well, which is a very strange experience for me. And it has sort of so yeah, in terms of my sort of sense of myself and my presence in the world, the awakening from the meaning crisis is definitely a bifurcation point. So, I mean, my narrative is, I was brought up, I think a person's, not everybody, of course, is brought up in religious context, but if you are, your religious like, it's analogous. You have a mother religion, like you have a mother tongue. Even if you never speak your mother tongue again, it's informed all your other language learning. But I was brought up in a fundamentalist Christian family, both the nuclear family and the broadly extended family, and of course, I didn't understand it at the time, except at levels of sort of anxiety and distress. That was traumatizing for me in some very powerful ways. And then of course, as you might, I mean, this sounds like a standard biography. In my adolescence, while at high school, I started reading some literature, and two or three major books. They just sort of blew me open.
Mm.
And it's just like these like it was just that kind of profound. It's like you've been living here and you suddenly realize the world is like that. And
do you remember any specific any of the particular books come to mind that?
Yeah, I know them by heart,
Yeah.
right? I don't mean I know the text by heart, but I know which ones that.
Yeah, such as, can you?
So there was a science fiction book by Roger Zelazny, who's part of what was called the New Wave. And science fiction is interesting, of course, because it's the fiction where we play with mythology and science and the relationship between them, which has a lot to do with, as you can see, the rest of my work. And so, and what that did for me is it exposed me to, Vedanta and Buddhism and Hindu mythology. It was just there's, right? Okay. And that just opened me up. And then around the same time, I read Siddhartha by Hermann Hesse, which had a similar effect on me. And then I was reading at the same time, Robertson Davies. Got to have a little plug for Canada in here. And his book called Fifth Business, which introduced me to Jung and the idea of the unconscious from a psychodynamic perspective. And of course, the importance of mythology and alternative ways of interpreting Christian doctrine, right? And this sort of just blew me apart. And so I'll just open up the chat because some people are making comments. And so I fell into my own, personal. I mean, I'm also an adolescent at the time, so I fell into my own personal meaning crisis. I became very nihilistic. Started publicly declaring that there is no purpose to human life, and arguing for that. And I got a somewhat infamous reputation at high school. People were simultaneously attracted to that, the sort of starkness of the dark vision, I suppose, but also somewhat horrified by it if they hung around it too long. But what started happening is, because of that, and because I started arguing and discussing with people, I started reading more and more deeply and more comprehensively. And when I got to university, I took a course on philosophy, and I met the figure of Socrates in an introductory course. And that provided for me a rearticulation and restructuring of what was happening for me. I reconfigured it around that I was searching for wisdom, and that wisdom had to do with leading an authentic and meaningful and virtuous life. Now, the thing that happened is, and at the time,
can I just pause you right there? Just
sure.
So when I talk about the sort of the potential and the crisis of the academy, that's what I mean in relationship to what I think we've lost, as sort of an organizing frame of the role of the academy. So that's just, brilliant for you to say that,
Exactly, Greg, because the academy sort of tantalizes me with this. And then what quickly happens, and many people that are in philosophy will tell you this, the topic of wisdom falls off the table. It's never discussed again. You spend infinite time working on, trying to refute skepticism and working out and I found all of this independently valuable, because it's very powerful set of tools for, reflecting on science, reflecting on culture, reflecting on ethics, reflecting on arts. And that's very, very powerful. But the original hunger that was partially satiated by the introduction to Socrates then went completely on, right, again. And so like I said, I went on academically in philosophy because I found an independent value in the tools. But I turned out of, I went outside the academy for the cultivation of wisdom. And so I was living near a place that was called the Meditation and Tai Chi Center, where they were teaching. And I'd already been, because of Siddhartha and Lord of Light and even Jung, I'd been already starting to do some meditating on my own, and I was getting a taste for it. And so I went there, and they taught an ecology of practices. That's where I got that idea from.
Yeah.
they taught Vipassana meditation, metta contemplation, and Tai Chi Chuan for flow induction. And
Maybe we could
that
get
was
an optimal grip on the world.
yeah, very much. And so that's where I got the radical introduction through an ecology of practices to these other kinds of knowing. I didn't articulate it that way at the time,
Sure.
but what was happening is I was being dumped into, being immersed in people who have a tradition of exploring and cultivating in depth procedural knowing, perspectival knowing, and participatory knowing. And so that just grew in me. Now, for a while, these two things were just trundling along. I was leading like these two lives, the wisdom cultivation life and the academic knowledge accumulation life. But then what happened, and I came to a point of frustration in the academic life. I got my MA in philosophy and then I left the academy.
Okay. Yeah, I wonder about that.
I got so frustrated that it was like, this is just not, right? It's not doing. So I left for about a year and I did these practices really, really deeply and got really started going more than a year. And then I started hearing about this new interdisciplinary thing, cognitive science.
Cognitive science, right? Yep.
That was actually trying to provide a much more comprehensive and integrative analysis of the mind, especially emphasizing its capacity for making meaning. That's how that's how cognitive psychology distinguished itself from behaviorism, for example. We talk about the mind works in terms of meaning. So I went back and I got into this and I really loved it. I loved the synoptic integration. And then as I got into it, I went back and I did a specialist BSc in cognitive science. I got a scientific training. And because I'd already done all the philosophy when I did my philosophy degrees, I didn't have to take any philosophy. So I was able to double up on all the psychology. So actually I ended up taking more psychology than you would for a psychology specialist.
Right.
So people started offering me while I was in graduate school, jobs teaching psychology courses. So I started teaching
at the University of Toronto. Was that
where
you were? Yep.
Started teaching the psychology courses. And what started to happen is the cognitive psychology and the cognitive science are starting to talk about wisdom before the philosophers, by the way.
Yeah.
The philosophers are now talking about it again, and especially because of Pierre Hadot and other important influences, Niehaus and others, right? But where I first saw academics treating it like as the central topic and exploring it was in psychology. Around 1990, a book was published called The Nature of Wisdom. It was the pivotal anthology that launched the field. So what started happening is I started to be able to teach about mindfulness. I think I was the first person at U of T to teach about it from a scientific perspective. And I was also starting to teach extracurricular courses on mindfulness. So I started teaching about mindfulness, insight. I started talking more about transformative experience, more and more about wisdom. I started to be able to teach a course on the psychology of wisdom. And so what happened was these two strands sort of kairotically just came together and suddenly they were interwoven deeply and really speaking to each other. And what happened is the interest in my work and my teaching among my students, suddenly like people, I could sense that it was making this huge impact.
Right.
And then my friend and colleague, Evan Thompson, was supposed to teach a course a long time ago called Buddhism and Cognitive Science, because he wrote The Embodied Mind. And he's
he's a founder. He's a major figure.
Founder. For cognitive science and the bridging between Buddhism and cognitive science, although he does not consider himself a Buddhist. And so he couldn't teach the course, and he said John would be a good person to teach that course. So I taught that course, and what I started to see was two things: that the confluence between Buddhism and cognitive science was very deeply analogous what had happened to me in my life. A wisdom tradition and this and cognitive science had come together. And of course that resonated with me. And then what I realized is why the students were taking this course is because they were trying to they had some inchoate, intuitive sense that they needed to do that. And then I started teaching about that.
Hold on. So you're saying like if we could put knowledge and wisdom together somehow, John, that would be like a good idea?
So yeah, so the course took off. And what happened is, as I started to broaden the course, and when you're teaching, of course, you start doing all this much more research. And I started gathering the argument that this wasn't just something amongst the student population, that this was reflective of the culture as a whole,
Okay.
that there was this, meaning crisis. And so the course started to evolve into an argument about that, the meaning crisis. The thesis of the course was that the confluence between Buddhism and cognitive science was occurring precisely because people were searching for a way of responding to the meaning crisis. So I started to really build that. And then I started to integrate that with my scientific work on relevance realization and my psychological work on the nature of wisdom. And then I had a student come to me. He was just finishing up, so there was no bribery involved or anything. He was done. And he said, this was a life-changing course for me. And he said, and he'd taken he'd taken those other courses with me as well.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, my dad's a professional editor. I'm a professional videographer, right? Everything.
Mm-hmm.
Let's put this, I got a bunch of friends. We'll work for free for you. Nobody ever says that to you, because we really believe in this and we want to get it out. And so Alan came to me, Alan Kyan, and he put a crew together and had his dad working. They were all happy. And I kept saying, you sure you don't want any kind of remuneration?
Mm-hmm.
No. And that's how the awakening from the meaning crisis came to be.
Beautiful. Beautiful. I haven't really asked you this. I'd like to, I've heard you mention this, but what is your sense of this sort of time between worlds? And how much of a crisis are we facing, John, in your estimation? And how has your view evolved, say, and where are you now in relation?
So that's a good question, Greg, because it's evolving since I released the series and the book. We shortly thereafter, Christopher Mastropietro and Philip Misafik and I took one part of the argument that many of my students found sort of the most fun part, which is the whole argument about the zombie mythology as a cultural expression of the meaning crisis. That's the book. So I'm by nature kind of a dour person. My friends say, some of my best friends that say that I sort of wear a cloak of melancholy, which is kind of interesting because I tend to see the world somewhat through dark glasses. So I was responsive to what Alan had said to me, and I thought it was, and I mean this seriously, I thought it was morally important for me to at least put out the argument and put out the information. But I wasn't sure of the reception or the potential impact or making a difference. I thought it was a good argument, right? I had confidence at that. But there's lots of good arguments on YouTube, and they don't necessarily go anywhere or make any significant impact. But of course, my colleague and somebody who I'm sort of on basically friendly terms, Jordan Peterson, had sort of opened things up in a certain way.
Have people heard of him?
Yeah. Uh-huh. So I was pessimistic. My view was that. So my view is that we are genuinely facing a meta crisis, ecological, socioeconomic, energy, and they're all interacting. A political crisis of gridlocking. We're seeing the undermining of many of democracies. And I think, and these are all interconnected. Thomas Bjorkman calls it the meta crisis.
Right.
The idea is the crises are real. They're not independent. They interact with each other in very complex ways that makes solving any one of them very difficult. And then I argue, I'll just state it now, but I have arguments for this, that the meaning crisis so denudes us of the resources for transformation and transcendence and cognitive flexibility and insight and for bringing about a radical change in what we're deeming real and relevant, that the meaning crisis really almost sort of cognitively lobotomizes us. So we're very incapable of addressing the meaning crisis. I was just contacted by somebody from the EU in Brussels. We had an interview. He wants to talk to me about how we have to, how we have to address the climate change problem, but he doesn't want to talk to me about anything about weather or climate, or he wants to talk to me about how do we get people to transform? How do we afford aspiration? How do we enhance cognitive flexibility? Because there's the dawning realization that just dumping the propositions on people is not working.
It's almost as if the world needs therapy, John.
You'd think so. And so I was generally, like I said, but what happened, and you are an example of this, is the series put me in touch with a lot of people, both people at the theoretical level. Well, Greg, you fall in two camps, right? People who are at the theoretical level, and then people who are at the practice level. I don't like to say practical because that word has taken on another connotation that's not appropriate. But people who are actually practicing, and so I started meeting people like you, Jordan Hall, right? And the people at Rebel Wisdom. But I also started to meet all of these emerging communities of practice, like Rafe Kelly and Sevilla King, and like where people are basically cultivating ecologies of practices in order to try and awaken themselves and each other from the meaning crisis. Got into dialogue, and I mean this both as a pun and as a real thing, good faith dialogue with people of some of the existing religions who are trying to see the ways in which their religions might be reformulated and revivified. I think that Paul Vanderklay and Jonathan Pajot are much more radical than they will admit they are. But we're friends, so I'm allowed to say that.
Actually, I'd like to double click here for a second, if you will, okay? Because I think this issue, I hope folks are feeling a drumbeat here, right? So there is a fragmented, chaotic pluralism that can be transcended some. There's potential for cohering or certain knowledge systems. I think they're key fault lines. And then it's using those fault lines, bridging them and transforming them into something genuine, wisdom at one level. And I know, John, you talk a lot about your belief that in response to awakening from the meaning crisis is the cultivation at some level of a religion that's not a religion.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly it. So that's why, and that's why the good faith dialogue with people that are homed within existing religious traditions are genuinely important to me, and I am very respectful of the religious traditions, because I think most of the religio, most of the meaning-making connections that are conducive to meaning in life, and most of the practices by which we overcome self-deception and afford self-transcendence, the ecologies of practices that have addressed that have for a very long time been homed within religious worldviews and religious communities. And I think it would be a great mistake to not pay attention. That's why many secular symptoms of the meaning crisis have a religious tone or religious quality to them.
You mean like a tree in a garden?
or the people going on but this bizarre behavior of people going on zombie walks that we talk about in the book, which is a really bizarre thing for human beings to do, right? If you were to say to them, I want you all to dress up as as people from the Christian narrative in the thousands and walk down the streets, they'd all say ha ha ha. But you know what they'll do? They'll dress up like zombies and stay in character for hours and walk around together. And it's like, what the hell is going on?
Jesus.
Right. Or Comic-Con, or going into a video world and like becoming a wizard. I mean, all of that. We talk about a lot of these examples in the book. We talk a lot about it in an article we just published in the journal, The Side View, all the symptoms of the meaning crisis. And so I think that what we need is we need to exact as much as we can ecologies of practices with some good education from the existing religions, but we need to put those ecologies into deep dialogue with the emerging and cutting edge cognitive science and see if we can resituate the ecologies back into a scientific worldview, which of course is why the connection to Gregg's work is so important, because in many ways that's Gregg's problem. I don't mean to trivialize it, Gregg. I hope that wasn't too simplified for you.
That it embodies it, John. Exactly. That's a while ago, I wasn't sure why I was really called to first call it the tree of knowledge, but this is the essence of the issue, is that this is a knowledge, wisdom, science, religion conundrum that we face in the 21st century. And it is the tackling of that Worldknot, as it were.
Very much, very much. And so I think that, like there's good evidence that if you belong to an established wisdom tradition and all the traditional ones are within a religious framework, you are actually much more likely to be successful in becoming wiser than if you try to do it within a secular situation. But for reasons that go back to my own personal biography, and also because of the fact that the nuns, the NONES, people who declare that they have no religious affiliation, are the fastest growing demographic group, trying to recommend to people that they should simply return to non-viable religious traditions that are not currently well coordinated with the scientific worldview. I don't think that's going to be a viable proposal for many people. And if you take a look at the nuns, you'll see that they're not sort of all new atheists. In fact, the majority of them self-describe as spiritual, not religious, and they often have, a lot of them, very wonky metaphysical views. So the idea that these people are largely irreligious is not correct. What they basically have is the religion of me, or the religion of we, of a little tiny group. And so and that group is growing, and it's growing at the same time as the sort of the nihilistic effects of the meaning crisis are becoming more pervasive. So trying to simultaneously address, right, those people, respond to nihilism, which I think requires something like the kind of comprehensive transformations that you used to find in religion. At least that's how I've experienced it myself, and what I have a lot of argument and evidence for.
Amen.
I think what we have to do is we have to create a religion that's not a religion. It's got to give us all of what the religions used to give us without committing us to the axial age, two-world mythology, without binding us into ways of thinking about all of this just in terms of ideology, just in terms of belief systems, etc. And, people are kind of trapped sort of between two traumas. Many people have been traumatized to varying degrees by the established religions, which is why they've left. But many of them are aware of the way in which pseudo-religious ideologies like Nazism and communism drench the world in blood. And so they're sort of trapped, not knowing which way to go.
Yes. And so now, as you I believe that you think about this new phase that you're in terms of dialogos, as cultivating the kinds of, at least the transformational practice, and seeding the potential of connection and awareness that would enable the kind of transformation that you would hope to see.
Well, thank you, Gregg. That helps me not have to shamelessly promote some of my recent work. So thank you. But to be more serious, the proposal for this actually emerged in a way that exemplified it. So I was talking to, somebody, a mutual friend, Jordan Hall, and he was talking, and he's very interested in the ecology of practices. But he said, but you need a meta practice. You need a meta practice that helps people gather, curate, coordinate, vet, transform the ecologies of practices so that like an ecology, they can more appropriately evolve to what he sees as the acceleration of the meta crisis. And I went, that's right. That's right. At the same time, with dialogues I was having with Jonathan Pajot, he said, oh, John does all this work, but it's all about all these practices and
Right.
processes, but it's all very individual. And he's missing, he's missing the community aspect. And I went, Jonathan's right. Jonathan's right. And so I went in and I looked at like a person who I had continued to study on my own all throughout that entire biography, which is the figure of Socrates and the whole Socratic tradition that starts with Socrates and moves through Plato and Aristotle into Stoicism and into the Neoplatonic tradition. And this practice of dialectic and how it was continuously in continuous development for basically a millennia or more, and it's a process, and Gregg knows a lot about this. It's a process that integrates sort of an internal alignment of aspects of the psyche with an external alignment of how we can discourse with each other, so that we can make those two movements a coordinated movement by which we can afford getting into the machinery. So most of our, I was going to say something, I realized I hadn't introduced the topic. Most of our cognition is done in distributed cognition. Long before the internet networked computers together to disclose the power of network computation, culture networked people together to release the power of distributed cognition. We're relying on it right now. I didn't invent this language that I'm using. None of you did either. I didn't invent any of this equipment. I'm not running the electric grid. I'm not maintaining the Zoom platform, and on and on and on. Other than your naked body, I would predict that everything that is around you or you're using is the result of distributed cognition. But of course, we've created this bullshit about being rugged individualists in our cognition, which of course I think traumatizes lots of people, and Gregg has to help them in therapy with that. And so what dialectic into dialogos is a practice where you're basically coordinating meditative and contemplative practices individually with getting into something like a collective flow state with other people, so that you can tap into the power of collective intelligence and then recursively exact it, transform it into collective wisdom. And the idea is that collective wisdom, and there's evidence and argument for this, is the best thing we have for a meta practice that will help us to gather together. It'll train us, it will enculturate us in the kind of processing and the kinds of character and the kinds of sensitivity, the awareness of normativity that we need in order to create good and vibrant ecologies of practices and communities that sustain them. And this, of course, is exactly what dialectic was in the ancient world. So what I've been doing is trying to do the historical analysis and then do tons of participant observation, get involved with circling, insight dialogue, empathy, empathy circling, the anti-debate, and talking to people like Gregg, who, how is this overlap with the kind of things that go on in therapy? And also all these emerging communities of practice around all of these, they're growing like weeds. All of these communities where people are rediscovering the flow state within distributed cognition and how powerful. And what's interesting is when you go into these practices and you're involved, for example, in Guy Senstock's circling practice, and people start doing it. I'm doing participant observation. These are secular people. The language they start to use for describing what emerges and what they're experiencing, what they're participating in, it's inevitably religious language. They use all this religious language and spiritual language. And so my hope is that by talking to all of these emerging practices, deeply dialoguing with them, and doing the historical resurrection, or at least refurbishing of the ancient practice of dialectic, that working with many people, Christopher Mastrietto is my main partner, but also people like Gregg and Guy and Jordan, we can craft a version of dialectic for us that can serve as a place where we can create the kind of community and distributed cognition that will properly home and cultivate the ecologies of practices that people need in order to respond to the meaning crisis. So I do think that dialectic will play a central role in the religion that's not a religion. Sorry, I think I'm talking an awful lot.
That's no, I was just soaking that in. That was beautiful. So I'm going to offer a few other things, then we'll open it up to questions. Okay. Um, so, so one of the things that I want to just, I'm continually struck by the degree of convergence across so many different domains. So those of you that know, so inner and outer dialogues.
Yeah. Greg, I can't hear you.
My microphone. Can you hear me?
I can hear you now.
Okay. So we had one of the fundamental basic maps that I use around human consciousness is a phenomenological heart system, our perspectival participatory knowing guided by valence qualia and then witness functions, right?
Yep.
And then a private narrator, okay, which we'll get more into when we do the self, and then a public self. And the flow within that, when that is shared to create a sense of relational value and coherence, what you find is you find people nourished, psychologically nourished,
deeply,
and moving towards transcendent and realization. Okay. And then what you so often find is broken static between the body, between the phenomenology, between a narrator and a public self, constant filtering, constant conflict, constant challenge and struggle, a broken dichotomized space interpersonally, interpsychically. Those are the people that come to see me. And with brutal internalizing neurotic conditions and conflicts and isolation and despair. Okay. So to me, it's striking to me to have that. That's a very basic model on both accounts, right? It's just basic. What is our human natures? What are the kind of interpersonal, intrapsychic contexts that we are oriented to come together around? And what is conducive to building the kind of social ecologies that are oriented toward flourishing? I think we know a huge amount about that. It's sad to me that we don't know how to consolidate that, how to distribute that, and cultivate ecologies of practice that actually watch that flourish. And I think that that's what I see you doing and what you described there in relation. So I'm going to pull up I'm going to share my screen real fast because I just have to share this diagram to show the interface. And I just want to walk some folks through it. We talked about this at the second to last, the penultimate episode. But I'm going to share my screen and then I'll hush up and I'll invite folks so if folks can see my screen here. So
I can see your screen, Greg.
Okay. So here is, this is my representation of John's fundamental brilliant theory around cognition. And I share this just to build off what I was just tracking off there, was to show the synchronicity between our ideas is quite striking. And so what I'd like to do is I'd just like to show you, for me, when I heard about John's recursive relevance realization, and by the way, somebody asked, and this is, I think, a good question that I'm not sure that we highlighted enough in the video. SIM stands for scale invariant multi-level modeling. And what it refers to is the constant iterative processes across hierarchy to stay in contact. It stays in context both within a system and between systems to maintain harmony through a recursive relevant realization process. Okay. And what this does is it captures both the nature and generative function of the cognition in what I would call the neurocognitive functionalist model of mind. And it just does so unbelievably brilliantly in my estimation. But what John and I then are syncing up around is, okay, here's a broad model of sort of thinking about science, the natural scientific account of humanity writ large, and organized in relationship to a model of both reality and our scientific modeling of it. We talked about a shared sense of description, which, as John and I know, what do we mean when we talk about consciousness, mind, self,
Yeah.
unbelievable complexity there, yet we have models of the 4 P's of knowing and my map of mind that correspond really
Yeah.
dramatically closely. And that allows for a metaphysical syncing up in a way that I found to be extremely exciting. By metaphysical syncing up, I don't mean anything magical, mystery, or supernatural. I simply mean our concepts and categories align with a level of precision that is, in my estimation, very important. A number of people have metaphysical models, but I think you also need meta-theoretical models.
Yeah.
Those are a trans-paradigmatic view. And John, you identify, and I think totally rightly so, as adopting an integrative model of cognitive science. And I think
Yes,
you
very much.
capitalize it, right?
Yeah.
Where you basically say these are different territories, but there is a mountain range view of these different territories that has potential to cohere. And
Yeah.
then you offer a foundational thread that ties the various mountain ranges together and allows for a coherent picture to pop. And that's what I experience your theory is doing. And then for this complex interconnected relation of constructs of both cognition, of intelligence, and of phenomenological consciousness. And our journey allowed us to connect that to what I did is sort of create a neurobehavioral evolutionary base, okay, that they would then set the stage for the evolution of a neurocognitive SIM3R model.
Mm-hmm.
And then we saw that link up very nicely. We then also saw the linkage between, okay, when we put this model in relation to a intersubjective other, the model that gives rise to then a potential relational recursive relevance realization. And then finally, there's this connection between the system of propositional knowing, which then gives us our distributed cultural network of persons that know. And so ultimately what you see then is while I developed these 4 different models, I didn't really have a precise model of neurocognitive functionalism that would enable me to go from cognition and intelligence into consciousness. And boom, I find John, not only does he have that, but the way it networks and coheres the system together has been, it's been truly transformational for me. So I just wanted people to see that lock and key interrelation, and just one of the reasons that I've been really psyched about our syncing up, as it were.
So for me, first of all, your slides are great, by the way, Greg. For me, the fact that what I look for when I'm doing my work, I look for independent lines of convergence because they tend to increase the plausibility, the theoretical plausibility of your constructs. And so the fact that there is this convergence, and then, like I said, one of the things this series has afforded me is meeting a lot more of this convergence. Obviously, there's a selection bias there, but nevertheless, when the people that are being selected have worked out things to the degree that Gregg has, then it becomes I think a very good plausibility argument for the theoretical work. So that's been a godsend to me. So thank you for that.
Well, I've got, me, I got a million more questions and possible domains that we can explore, but I want to make sure that other folks have an opportunity to share their reflections, observations, and questions. So why don't we just transition into the Q&A. Actually, I'll pause right there as people think about that. John, I see some questions already coming up. Is there anything that you want to make sure that you have an opportunity to share that we didn't necessarily touch on in that summary, or anything that's alive for you or on your mind that you wanted to?
I don't think so. I think that was a very good overview in many ways. I'm happy right now.
Great. I see a hand. Nick, you have a question.
Hey, John, big fan. Great to finally meet you and see you speak.
Nice to meet you too.
It's really cool. It's really special, honestly. So earlier you were talking about like the meaning crisis kind of depleting our capability to hit this this point of transcendence.
Mm-hmm.
So essentially, I'm going to be asking you here if you believe in free will, because I come from an almost entirely non-dual perspective.
Yeah.
I don't personally believe in free will.
Mhm.
I don't think we have to do anything to do this. I think this transcendence is going to happen. This fifth joint point, next stage in evolution is going to happen. I don't think we have to individually or in a group choose to do anything to make it happen. But that's kind of what I'm asking you. Do you think we actually need to choose to do these things, or do you think that it's, you know, it's evolution that's going to drive itself forward?
Oh, that's a very complex question, and let me try and answer it in stages, if you'll allow me.
Yeah.
I would first of all separate the existence of choice from the existence of free will. I don't think that the first is evidence of the latter. So in that sense, I'm deeply influenced by, for example, Spinoza. So I think what we've always meant by choice was the degree in which our so I'll use language that I think is appropriate to Spinoza, but what is technically anachronistic because he wouldn't have had it available. I think when I choose, what I mean when I say that is the most causally relevant factor for explaining my behavior is the self-organizing processes within my consciousness and cognition right now. Whenever we give an explanation of why something is happening, we always give the causally relevant thing. Well, why did the Titanic sink? It depends what you want to answer. It sank because it hit an iceberg. It sank because Britain was competing with America. It sank because the British steel had flaws in it at that temperature, and the British steel had flaws in it, but blah, blah, blah. The actual explanation for any event is the entire previous history of the universe. And this is a standard problem in the philosophy of science. So there's nothing illegitimate about zeroing in on causal relevance. It's what we do everywhere, all the time, whenever we're giving an explanation. So if the causally, so I can invoke it legitimately, is what I'm saying. So if the most causally relevant factor for explaining what I need to explain about my behavior is the dynamical self-organization going on within my consciousness and cognition, that is when we make a choice. But I don't think that in any way indicates that we have some soul-like boss in the center of us that can create actions ex nihilo like a god inside a sort of internal universe. I think that's a misleading idea. And secondly, I think it's ultimately an idea that does not drive morality, but actually undermines it. So I'm rejecting both it for metaphysical reasons and for moral reasons. The last thing I want is for my actions to be arbitrarily disconnected. You know what I actually am questing for in my life? I want my thoughts to be as completely determined by what is true as possible. I want my sensibility to be as completely determined by what is beautiful as possible. I want my actions to be as completely determined by what is good as possible. That's what I'm after. I don't want freedom of will. I want the most complex responsibility and responsivity possible. So both for metaphysical and moral reasons, I reject, right, the idea of choice being evidence for or being identified with freedom of the will. So I think I would say that. And then when it comes to the idea of do we have to make it happen or wait for it to happen, I'm concerned about that because that sounds to me like the dichotomy that we were given between sort of rationalism, sort of romanticism, where it's I express my will, or empiricism, where I'm the blank tablet that gets written upon. And what I've been trying to argue on the basis of really good 4E cognitive science is both of those are false, right? What's actually happening is a self-organizing loop that I participate in. And if you take a look at the non-dual traditions, you can see this in Nishida, you can see it in Nishitani, you can especially see it in Tanabe when he talks about self-power and other power and how they actually are transcended in non-duality to afford the transformation that's actually needed. And so, sorry, I'm shouting. I didn't mean to. I'm just getting passionate about this. Part of it is also you triggered that sense of exposure when you talked to me like you said you knew me. Remember I mentioned that? And so I'm overcompensating. I can feel it. So I'll try and dial it down. But that's how I would answer your question. So I think you can move out of both. You can liberate, if you'll allow me, the idea of agency. I prefer to talk about agency rather than choice from free will. And then you can integrate that into the cultivation of virtue, and you can integrate that into a sense of participation rather than action or passion. And that makes sense when we talk about the cultivation of virtue and the cultivation of wisdom. That's why we even use words like cultivation. You don't make a plant and you just don't wait for it to happen, right? You cultivate it. You do things to improve the conditions by which it can self-organize.
That's great. Actually, that's a wonderful transition for Gregg Thomas to ask a question. Gregg, we got introduced, and he's been on Rebel Wisdom and done some cool stuff on jazz. I think you.
Yeah, I think he reached out to me in an email, and I have not responded to him, and I apologize for that. It's a pleasure to meet you, Gregg.
Same here, John.
I'm super busy. No.
No need to explain.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Really, not at all. I figured that the time will come, and perhaps it will begin right now.
Yes.
I want you to know.
You have been recommended to me by others, by the way.
Oh, so. Really? Oh, okay, cool. I want you to know that Awakening from the Meaning Crisis is a foundation for a course I'm teaching now on what I'm calling cultural intelligence, which has a part to do with the email I sent you, and my question has to do with that. But since no one else knows what we're talking about, I'm going to jump right into the question, and it is this. Is there a distinction between intersubjectivity and transjectivity, which is your coinage, or are they basically synonyms?
I think one is a species of the other genus. Ooh. I think transjectivity between people is intersubjectivity, but I think there's a larger genus in which you can have, I think even non-person cognitive agents have a transjective relation. This is what we mean in 4E cognitive science, that even a dog has embodied, embedded, enacted, extended cognition. So I think I would say that intersubjectivity is a particularly powerful and important way in which we can access and become more aware of transjectivity within a cooperative situation that then prepares us for, if you'll allow me, the more impersonal aspects of transjectivity. That's what often happens in the dialectic process. If you want to get people sort of to have affection, to fall in love with being, talking to them like that won't do it, right? And I think, by the way, that's the short answer of how you overcome the meaning crisis. You got to get people so they can fall in love with being again. But the way you do that, right, is you first get people, right, to have that sense of intimacy, coupled connection, affection, reciprocal opening with other people. And then when they start to become aware of the power and the potential within that, they start to become affectionate to the process that is making that possible. And then that opens them up to a more expansive understanding and accessing of transjectivity.
Beautiful. And I just want to make a quick statement that when I hear you talk about dialogos, it reminds me of what I call the higher frequencies of democratic discourse.
Oh, I like that. Oh, that's beautiful.
Really, because when you look at the very process of democracy as democratic conversation,
yes,
as what Danielle Allen, political philosopher at Harvard, in her book on the Declaration of Independence, Our Declaration, she talks about there was a process to write the Declaration that was a group writing process.
Yes.
Thomas Jefferson is officially, that was a group writing process. And that was a process of dialogos, both directly in dialogue, verbally, but also in writing. And there's something about that that has to do with the very democratic process that I think is important for us to explore.
I think that's right. I think that's deeply right. And I like the metaphor. It actually jives with a paper that Chris and I are trying to get published right now about how we talk about behind any, behind whatever we speak, there's the much more that we convey. And when we try to speak what we convey, we just open up the deeper levels of conveyance. And then we talk about how you have sort of everyday discussion But when the conveyance starts to break down, because there's, right, we move to debate, but then as you're indicating, we move to the if the shared normativity that's required for debate breaks down, we move to this higher level of dialogos, in which we're basically trying to re-engineer cultural communing so that we can get back to a shared conformity, so that we can then drop down to resolvable debate and then drop back down from there into living our lives in social cooperation. And I think even think about the way, so I'm deeply influenced, of course, by Dewey on one hand and Habermas on the other, right? And you can see the universal pragmatics in what I just said. But putting the two together, the idea of that what democracy is supposed to be is something very analogous to living things. It's supposed to be a fundamentally self-correcting process that uses opponent processing. And we've lost that. It's broken down into adversarial zero sum. But if we could get back to people committing, right, to the shared project of self-correction, right, the higher frequencies that you talk about, I think that would do, I think all the attempts, sorry, this is going to be really bold, everyone. I think all of the attempts to restore democracy at the political level are pretty much doomed to fail, because we have so eroded the communicative machinery and the shared normativity that's needed that I don't think the answer is going to come there. I think what we have to do is get back into what Aristotle thought, that politics is ultimately about living the good life and about meaning making and about creating culture. And so we have to get into the machinery, the non-propositional machinery, where most of that heavy lifting is done. And I don't think political ideology is going to do it at all. And so, look, you have two choices when you're facing burgeoning complexity. You can either look for the single answer that's the final story for all time, right? Or you can get into a process that can adaptively evolve because it's dynamically self-correcting. And the choice of democracy is that way, and the choice of authoritarianism is that way.
Thank you so much, man. Thank you.
Said. So we have Rachel and then Michael. Rachel, would you like? Can you? Oh.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you now, Rachel.
Hi. So yes, John, thank you for all the work that you've done for this community. First of all, I'm a member of your Discord channel, and I've been loving the live audio chat. The meaning crisis is fascinating to me. I actually wanted to ask you about something that I'm struggling with a little bit, that thing being mindfulness. I heard you mention that you were the first mindfulness instructor.
Yeah. Yes.
Now, as I'm sure you know, mindfulness has become very du jour, from corporations to apps to pretty much everything is mindfulness, mindfulness. And I find that gives me anxiety. Embodiment. I feel like more disembodied because there's a constant pressure to be mindful and embodied. And it was actually, maybe it was partially due to quarantine, but I had a pretty serious anxiety attack because I felt like I wasn't mindful or embodied enough to like even be in society, like at all. And then the inner voice in my head, it kept screaming, you're never going to get anywhere unless you're embodied enough. You're never going to succeed until you're more mindful. People are never going to like you until you're mindful enough. Focus on your body, bitch. You know, just really brutal stuff, probably due to my own psychological trauma. But I can't help but think that much of this was the constant watered down mindfulness commercialization that I see everywhere. How would you recommend that somebody like me conquers this and is able to be mindful and embodied without getting triggered by the constant stream of mindfulness commercialization?
Excellent. So like you, I hope you don't find, this is intended to be an act of sharing. I hope you don't find it insulting. I also suffer from a sadistic superego in a lot of ways. And that my friends gave me that I didn't come upon that insight myself. And of course, I think it has to do with that I was brought up with a particular model of God, etc. So I won't go into that in detail, but I commiserate with you very readily. And then on the other hand, and I've published on this, I've published and given talks at conference. I'm very, very critical of the Western appropriation of mindfulness. And mindfulness is not seated meditation that makes you sort of accept your status quo within present day capitalism. That's not what mindfulness is, right? In fact, there isn't even a single act or practice that's mindful. Mindfulness is properly an ecology of practices. There should be meditative practices, there should be contemplative practices, there should be movement practices, and they should be all integrated together in a mutually self-correcting fashion. And even the scientific study of mindfulness, I have criticisms of, published criticisms of. They tend to reduce mindfulness to just a list of features, which is just overly, when you just, all you have is a list of features, you're missing all the structural, functional organization of a phenomena. So you have this truncated and superficial version that's wedded to an overly simplistic importation that is helped to use to sell people basically something that's analogous to Soma from Brave New World. So as you can tell, I'm very critical of this. I think what you have to do is you should join a community. Like I've done an online for COVID. I met daily and took people through a meditation course, meditation and contemplation course. It's all on YouTube. And then we went into the Western tradition, and we've gone through Epicureanism and Stoicism and giving you a rich repertoire and strategies for how to integrate and cultivate an ecology of practices. And this is all framed within a different way of formulating this, which is meant to subvert my sadistic superego and other people. And this is a metaphor that comes from the heart of the Buddhist tradition, which is, think of mindfulness practices, notice the plural, as a way of befriending yourself, rather than a way of trying to meet some external standard that has been given to you. And so for me, the idea that what I'm trying to do is befriend myself with other people that I can befriend who are befriending themselves. And that if we can all not use standards of harsh perfectionism, because what the hell good are they for? They're not good for anything. What if you did mindfulness under the standard of cultivating a virtuous friendship with yourself and other people? And that actually goes well with mindfulness as a rich and evolving ecology of practices that is homed within a Sangha. It's always the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. And if all they're giving you is a little smidgen of the Dharma, they're just starving you. And they're putting you into a normative structure that I think is actually deleterious to the transformation people want. All of these things, I mean, another slogan I have is I talk about stealing the culture. All of this is radically countercultural. I want to do, sorry, this sounds ridiculously pretentious, but remember what I said about there is no political solution, to quote the Police. I hope you guys are old enough to know that the group, the Police, right? Spirits in the Material World, great Gnostic song. Right, I think I want to be like what the Christians were. They set up communities of transformative practice, and then they networked together and they created a counterculture that stole the culture bottom up. I'm not saying I'm not trying to convert anybody to Christianity, but what I see all of these communities that are emerging and starting to network together doing is they're stealing the culture. And so I would like to teach people mindfulness in the context of befriending themselves so they can steal the culture.
Beautiful. Yeah. It's worth noting here, I think, again, another point of convergence. So I'm not a meditative practitioner, but I'm a big believer in psychological mindfulness. And so basically that's a metacognitive stance. And you can extract a huge amount of wisdoms from some basic principles of, what I try to encapsulate in calm.
Yeah, calm, MO. That's correctly.
Just curious, acceptance, loving compassion, motivated toward valued states of being, in relationship to a critic, which is critical, rejecting, irritable, tense, and controlling. So that, in other words, AKA a sadistic superego. and then embodying that in relation. Think about yourself as sort of internal family systems and how to cultivate that inner dialogue along those lines, and then interpersonal dialogue in the proper context for that. And,
sorry, Greg, I didn't mean to interrupt.
no, go ahead.
I'm influenced here also by Han and his idea that we have moved, and this is how he has a critique of Foucault, right, and the panopticon idea. It's one of the best and most succinct critiques of Foucault that I've read. But Han has the idea that we have now moved into the stage of self-exploitation by being put into an achievement culture. And that's exactly the opposite of what at least the Buddhist and Taoist homes of mindfulness were supposed to be doing.
Interesting. Mike Mascolo has a question. Unmute.
I tend to sound better when I'm muted. Hello all. John, this was a very exciting talk. I wish I had a question for you. I don't. I wish that what I kind of want to be able to do is to celebrate what you've said and comment on it or ask you a question, but I can't do it. And so I apologize that the way I want to try to connect to what you're saying is to give an opinion of what's been moved in me from what you've said. So I'm going to talk about me rather than you, even though I want to talk about you. I'm sorry.
It's okay.
Greg, could you give me a share screen capability? Greg? Yeah, okay, good. I'm resonating so deeply with what you're saying. It's the crisis of meaning. You know, the crisis of meaning is about, you know, for me, ideological cacophony and a technological worship where we think that everything is going to get solved by our technical and capitalist free market. And as I look and I listen to what you're saying, and I listen to people like you and what you're saying, it's really complex. That what we're doing, and we got a lot of smart people talking about complex issues. Mm-hmm. And I ask myself, well, how do we create a movement with such complexity? You know, how do we reach people? Which leads me to this idea of simplicity. Is there some way that we can take these highfalutin ideas and reduce them, not dumb them down, but to make them simple like Bach, you know, to make them in some way that an anchor of ideas that can begin to generate these communities, these ecologies of practice that you talk about. Yeah. And this is my best failing attempt to do this. A kind of a thinking about how it all comes together, if you will, and if you'll indulge me for 1 minute.
Sure.
Everyone.
Please.
I think that at base, we are relational beings. Mm-hmm. And I think that that is a very integrating concept. I think we're relational beings. What that means for me, and I'm going to go back to McMurray, a theologian, who talks about fundamental motives of humans as being, you know, a dialectic between fear for the self and love for the other. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I believe, as a relational person, that all identity, all selfhood, all practice, all morality, all ethos comes from intersubjective relations. It comes from how we relate to the other. It doesn't come from God, doesn't come from evolution, it doesn't come from Kant's mind, it comes from relations, that they emerge from relation. And that when we relate, we create a morality of rights, a morality of care, and a morality of virtue. And I think something like a trichotomy like this, or like Gregg's integrity, that which enhances dignity and integrity through well-being through integrity. If we could get people to see, hey, we are relational beings, and what ties us together is some notion of virtue, the good. We don't talk about the good. We talk about technical stuff. We talk about, you know, how do we solve things through the market? We don't understand that all of this is tethered to, in my opinion, a conception of the good, We don't talk about that. I say if we can find ways to get people to begin to talk about virtue, not just individual rights, but care and virtue, that provides the glue or the motivation for communities or ecologies of discussion to coordinate, to bring together diverse ideologies, clash them together in such a way that we can find the good in them and create something novel. And that something novel might be knowledge, if you will. I don't know how much sense I just made.
Yeah.
The idea here is how can we get to the masses in a way that is as simple as Edith Bunker, and then bubble up to be the profound transformations that we need.
So I want to respond to you in depth because I think your point is prescient in an important way. You have to allow me to distinguish between when I'm talking about some of this stuff in the language of explanation and science to try and articulate it so it could fit into a scientific worldview, and how I talk or what we do when we're engaged in the practice. What you just described, Michael, is what we do in the practice of dialectic. We don't do any of this heavy theory. You get people to come in, you get them to circle to get into distributed cognition, and then this is how the practice goes. One of you is going to start. You're going to propose, we're going to pick the four of you are going to pick a virtue. You're going to propose an account, what you think that virtue is. What's courage? And then what another person's going to do is they're not going to dispute you or debate you. They're going to amplify you. They're going to be a mindfulness mirror. They're going to say, oh, when you were getting to this one point, you clenched your fist. Go back and clench your fist. What does that feel like? Draw this out. And so what you do is this amplification process. You're constantly drawing the person out to say more and more about what that particular virtue is. And then you move to a stage where the second person, basically after the first person says they're finished, the second person comes back and says, okay, here's what I heard you saying. I want to make sure. And I don't get to go on until you agree that I have heard you. And so you do this until the first person says, okay, now you've heard me. And now then the second person now says, well, what did they learn? What did they appreciate? What did they come to value? What was novel for them in this proposal? And then and only then they can say what was mysterious or missing or off for them. And what they have to do is like jazz, and maybe Gregg will like this, they have to riff. They can riff on the first. They can't make a totally new proposal. They have to amend the first proposal and riff on it to make a second. And then they make a proposal. And then another person does the process with them. And then they circle around and around virtue like a Platonic dialogue. And then what happens is you bring all of these small groups together and you have a group question, which is, what is virtue? Or what's the relationship between courage? What is our virtue? Or what's the relationship between courage and wisdom? And then you want to see people discuss virtue, and they don't discuss it as a cold topic because they've been involved in intimate relation with other human beings and the co-creation of new ways of seeing and being. I believe deeply in Plato's sense that you can't possibly learn about a virtue unless you already have some important seed of it within you. That's why he starts. That's why all of the dialogues are on virtue. And that's why many of the dialogues don't conclude with the definition, because the proposition is not where the answer to what is courage or what is justice to be found. It's found in the unfolding of the dialogue. And when people get a sense of that, and they don't want to come to a conclusion, they get into this state of wondering and together and constantly unpacking what virtue can mean for them. And you can see that they're identifying and engaging, and they're starting to aspire to the virtue, not just reflect on it. And it doesn't mean they're all saying the same thing, and it doesn't mean they're even generating a theory. That's what happens in the process and practice of dialectic.
Yes.
Another great.
So I'm asking for everybody to understand. That's why I often say to people, don't tell me what you believe, tell me what you practice. I'm giving you all these beliefs because I'm a scientist, right? And Gregg's a scientist. But the project is to translate these all into accessible practices of transformation. That's the project, through and through.
And it is tragic that the universities, which have become increasingly broken and pathetic, that what's leaving it is humanities, philosophy, and
Yep.
literature, the very things that we need in order to cultivate wisdom, imagination, and ways of living.
Yeah. And Nicholas Maxwell has been, I mean, I think I got to meet Nicholas Maxwell, and he's been a clarion call to that, about that for decades, right? From Knowledge to Wisdom, what, you know, is a pivotal book about that critique of the universities per se. Now, I want to be clear. I like the University of Toronto. They treat me very well, but I think, they've done, they have. I don't fit in well. I don't fit into the academic assortment box really well, and I'm really grateful for this. They sort of bent things and restructured things to make a place for me, and I want to express sincere gratitude for that. Nevertheless, I agree with your critique, Michael. I think the universities have become untethered for being what they should be. I think Nicholas is absolutely correct about that, and I think Zach is right about it too. That we, by severing education from the practice of intergenerational enculturation, we have ripped the guts out of education. Education should be about maintaining our culture. That should be its priority. Insofar as it can also help the market, okay, but not primarily about helping the market.
Corinne, you had a question. That's a brilliant, I couldn't agree more. I'm actually writing that section in my book right now.
Yeah, well, my question goes right along with this conversation, asking about, like you mentioned, literature was your breakthrough from your fundamentalist upbringing. So what, I'm wondering that, like, what role could art, music, literature, all of that play in the discussion we're having about how to move forward?
Oh, pivotal. I mean, so I have
how though, like how
Corinne
like,
is a professor of art, so
well, I mean, how is really important, because if there isn't, look, how can I try and say this without, the reason I'm stuck is because I've had like about, and it's on YouTube, we've had 6 long-term discussions between myself and Andrew Sweeney and Chris Masterpietro about about things like this.
Okay.
I'm trying to do like, I think that, let me try it this way. When I was talking to Michael, and you can see it, and I sort of alluded to Gregg, there's like a jazz element even in dialectic. And so I'm deeply influenced by Ellen Scarry and other people's work, that beauty trains us for unexpected truth and for virtues that we do not yet, we have not properly yet developed, and related arguments around that. And I know that not all of art is about beauty. I'm just zeroing in on this to give me a place to answer, to give you a way of talking about this. I think that if the best way to, well, I would argue one of the best ways, I'm being too strident, and here's where I'm a Platonist through and through. I think beauty is one of the most accessible, picking up on Michael's idea, ways in which we can get people, and this is Murdoch's point too, right? In which we can get people out of egocentrism, that we can get people to get to a place where it is actually possible for them to start to challenge a cultural cognitive grammar. And I think I can do all of this talking, but if there's no beauty in it, that it's going to be largely ineffective. So I think getting artistry in here, translating this, especially what I said earlier, if it's not primarily about the propositional, but the procedural and the perspectival and the participatory, we need artistry to make that translation and to beautify it so people will take it up in an aspirational fashion. I think art has a central role. That's why I was really pleased when Akira the Don took one of my things and he made a meaning wave about it. And I got to talk to an artist about this. And I talk to artists quite often, and they send me their work that was inspired by my work, which is like, wow, it's really, really interesting. And by the way, my relationship to literature and how it impacts on me is ongoing. I just read with a good friend of mine and colleague, Dan Chappie, The Plague by Camus. And I hadn't realized this. This was really interesting for me. I'd always taken this slogan from Camus, and it's from The Plague, and it's from a character called Taru. And when I started reading it, and Dan had already read it, and he said, "You're going to identify with Taru. You're Taru." And I'm saying, "What?" I'm reading this character, and it's Taru who actually utters this line. "I want to know how to be a saint without God. That's the whole problem I'm up against today." And I've taken that as one of my personal slogans. And seeing that, like encountering that within the narrative setting of these people, and of course the plague is a grand metaphor for, you know, the possibility of the loss of meaning, the confrontation with absurdity, all of Camus' themes. It does something, right? It does something. You know, in The Death of Ivan Ilyich, where Tolstoy talks about that Ivan had always knew he was going to die, the way 2 + 2 = 4, like a proposition. And then one day he realized, because he bangs his chest and he's not getting better, he realized he was going to die. And the proposition is the same, but you know that the meaning has totally changed because it's been set within the narrative context that gives you the perspectival and participatory knowing. That's exactly what happened when I encountered that line in The Plague. And art, that's the power of art. That's the power of art for me, to do exactly that kind of thing. And so I think it is one of the most important ways in which we can translate the propositional into the perspectival and the procedural and the participatory in a way that draws people, beautifies things, draws them outside of an egocentric perspective so they can seriously consider altering their cognitive cultural grammar and aspiring to something else than what they are. I hope that answers your question. I think this ultimately won't be done by people like me, that I'm talking about. I think it will ultimately be done. And don't forget, martial art is also an art. The martial artists are also doing art. When you do, I'm a Tai Chi martial artist. You don't do Tai Chi. The verb in Chinese is you play Tai Chi, like you play music. I'm making music with my body, right?
Other questions as we get near the hour-and-a-half marker here, John? Thanks so much.
I also wondered about the painting that's behind you. I always see the bottom of those horses, and I wonder where they're going.
So this is this is a thing from North Africa. It was given to me by my partner. I have a very strange and deep attraction to deserts. A sort of a desert aesthetic. So, you know, one of my favorite movies is Lawrence of Arabia and things like that. And so she gave me this, right, basically about that. So, and in fact, when I first moved into this apartment, I sort of set things up, and one of my best friends came over and he said, "Hey, the way you've designed this, it looks like a desert wisdom." And so she gave me this to fit into the desert wisdom sort of decor that I have. And so that's why it's there. And that's what it means to me. It's supposed to represent a really important historical moment within Moroccan culture. But that's all I got of the particular history.
Thanks for that, Corinne. I had wondered that too, that I never reached consciousness to ask. So there it is.
I keep changing my backgrounds because I used to do the bookshelf thing, and then people were like, they started, you know, and everybody has the bookshelf, and I thought, yeah, everybody does. And then I had people were they wanted to know what books were on my bookshelf rather than any of my work or any of the stuff I was trying to talk about. So yeah.
Great. Any other questions?
Okay, in case there was someone else who hadn't spoken, but I'm wondering, both for John and Michael, when you were speaking, I mean, I resonate with what you were saying, but I wonder to a certain extent whether or not it's a developmental issue that must be brought to bear. Where, when I say developmental, I don't mean to get into any particular developmental theory, but I mean to enact what you're talking about and those different qualities, right? Care, the good, and such. You have to increase your care and your intersubjective relating with wider and wider circles of people. So if you only care about the people in your immediate family or your ethnic group, etc., then that care could be there, but it may not extend further. I think so developmentally, we have to get to a point where enough of us have a circle of care that is broad and big enough and deep enough to encompass beyond our immediate groups, beyond our nation, to what I called in my last class, the big H, the humanity, as human beings. So I'm just wondering, John, if you think that actually has to be brought to bear, some developmental considerations.
Oh, I think it's inherently, I'll give Michael a chance to respond too, since you invoked him. Yeah, I think cognition when cognition is a dynamically self-organizing system, there's no clean or viable distinction between how it functions and its history. It develops by functioning and it functions by developing. There's no separation of those. You see this as we move from computers to neural networks and dynamical system models of cognition. I teach a course on cognitive development. Cognition is intrinsically developmental in nature. So if we're going to actually plug into cognition in its depths, we have to plug into it in a developmental program. So, I mean, one of the things that we're also talking about is like, what would be the developmental program that you would do, even to get people, even to scaffold people into the dialectic practice that I was describing to Michael. And then what would be, once they get there, how does that, and they're playing with this, seriously playing with this on the Discord server for the community around my work. They're doing this about trying to scale up from, entry practice levels to very increasingly expanding levels of practice. That's what they're trying to figure out. And they're doing a lot of work on that right now. So I think it's inherently developmental. And I think that's how it has to be, again, like a religion. Religions have that thing. You can enter religion as a child, but you are slowly, developed into something, and your understanding of the religion it doesn't always, but it can develop as you develop, and it opens the sphere that the religion gives you access to as you go through that. This was one of Paul Van der Klee's criticisms of me that I take seriously. He said the problem with what John is talking about is it's very elitist. And I take that criticism seriously as well. That no, it has to be exactly what Michael says. We have to be able to reach people coming, if you'll allow me, off the street, and they can go as far as they want. But that has to be true. They can go as far as they want or need to go in how they're developing. So that's one of the most tricky. And so I'm lucky in that there's a lot of distributed cognition at work on that problem right now. And I get to talk to those people on a regular basis. But I'll let Michael respond now too.
Thank you, John. And thank you for asking, Greg. Greg, I actually think that an answer to your question was, you gave it in a sense. When you talked about, the circle of communication, whatever, these circles, which would be very similar, it seems to me, to what John's talking about. If we can create circles within our sphere of influence, that's, and then each of those people can begin to create circles in their sphere of influence, you get bottom up stuff. And then if one could find a way to kind of codify how to have these dialogical circular relations, and you get a VIP, you get an Obama, you get a David Brooks, you get a whomever to start to talk from the bully pulpit. Hey, we need virtue, we need this. That'll start a movement. I don't know if you know this, but Scotland has a mission statement for their nation in which care and compassion is part of their mission. Could you imagine a government? Could you imagine the United States having that? Wouldn't it be great if you had something like that? It built into, we're going to care about, so bottom up and top down, there are ways to do this.
Mhm.
I'm reminded in that of something Rob Scott often you'll mention. Like we have to figure out also, kind of going back to the art and the process of making it cool at some level too. Making it enticing, making it something that says, "Hey, I want some of that," and definitely not come across as sort of elitist professors that have figured it out. I certainly have that danger, right? But it's like, oh, that's hip, or that's something that I really am curious about. I think this is where the art, the jazz, the music, the power of a charismatic figure, Obama-like figure that can actually speak and then embody that in a particular way, and then have that networked into these very sophisticated ideas that also have entry-level developmental sequences, right? That enable people and then to feel the jive, as it were, and then get that in the right zone of proximal development and move.
I just
along.
want to do something that I haven't been able to do yet. I just want to say hi to Tim. Hi, Tim. How are you?
Hey, John. How you doing, mate? Nice to see you.
My friend. Good to see you too.
Yeah, I've been silent, really enjoying it. But I actually just had a follow-on comment here. I know we're probably moving to close, but on this topic of making dialogos cool, let's say, or how to help a bottom-up process of people reaching out to each other, get involved in conversation, engage in discussion. That's been something I've been sort of looking at many different levels. One of them last year, when it was possible to be out in the world a bit more, was at bars and at restaurants, and at sort of making relationships with managers and seeing about inviting people and engaging them in discussion and what have you. And we did a number of events on that, and they were very meaningful in different ways. One of the main issues that I've found as a broad point that I'd ask for reflection on is that it seems to me like most social spaces, this is particularly the case in Australia and England, might be a little less so in America and Canada, but most social spaces past like even 5 p.m. Are sort of run on the fuel unit of alcohol. It's not really possible for these places to be open unless they're selling alcohol. And in my experience, alcohol is maybe antithetical is a bit strong, but I found it perhaps antithetical to actually enculturating the kind of meaningful flow fundamentally that we're looking to develop here. So I just wonder thoughts about alcohol. I've thought of drinks to replace it, but it's a real thorn, I find.
Yeah, so when we lost religious heritages, we lost the social space, the non-alcoholic, well, other than maybe the Eucharist, right? We lost sort of the non-alcoholic way of affording people disinhibiting so they could get into collective flow state. We had, within religion, you have other disruptive strategies that are much more successful at getting people out of mundane time and space. And you can think of cathedrals, for example, as these massive machines for putting the zap on your brain so that you're open to perspectives and you're open to connect to people, and you're not getting the alcoholic days to do that, right? So religions had these this amazing machinery of the disinhibition and putting you into a different headspace so that you could, but leaving you with sort of, but often enhancing your capacity for flow and cognitive flexibility. And so what I'm seeing in these communities of practices are people are basically doing in situ experimentations of how to create these alternative social spaces where we can get people to disinhibit. Rafe Kelly takes people out and they do parkour in nature, and then they come back and sit around a campfire and start talking. And you don't have to give people alcohol. Right? What happens is this kind of thing spontaneously starts to emerge. He's having tremendous success in it. So I think both from a scientific top-down and a bottom-up perspective in terms of in situ practice, we can recapture techniques of disinhibition that do afford people the possibility of catching the fire of aspiration without having to dumb them down and stupefy them with our really with this socially sanctioned drug. And it's because and part of what alcohol has done is it's been fed by and it feeds back into the cultural confusion between depth and intensity. Alcohol disinhibits you, so it intensifies certain aspects of your experience. But that is not the same thing as getting a deep experience. And it's amazing when people, for example, come into dialectic and they get caught up in and they talk about how powerful that is. And the language they use is really interesting because they talk about simultaneously, well, I like to use the word inventio. They talk about as if they're discovering something absolutely new, and then, but also like they're remembering something that was always there at the core of them. And I don't think alcohol does that for you. And I don't think alcohol is helping, because I think it tends to, I mean, it helps for other things. I understand, I mean, the human species has been helped to reproduce by alcohol, no doubt. But I think that insofar as we're using alcohol to disinhibit, it's not affording the cognitive flexibility, and it's actually enhancing the confusion of intensity with depth. And so trying to create alternative social spaces that do the disruptive practices, do the disinhibition, and get people out of mundane time and space, mundane sense of self, but also empower them for self-transcendence. We know that's possible. Religions have done that. And so, and things that look like religion are doing it right now. So it's a very real possibility. I don't know if, I mean, to make it something widely disseminated the way pubs and bars are, I don't see that happening given our current socioeconomic structures. So that might also have to be something that would come out of a successful stealing of the culture, very much the way the Christian churches created a different social space of agape, and that transformed non-persons into persons, and that spread like wildfire.
If I may, forgive the hokiness of this, but it seems to me that where alcohol fails, the great disinhibitor seems to me is caring and love in the service of meaning. People will be less inhibited if they feel loved.
Yeah, in fact, in fact, alcohol tends to create reciprocal narrowing. And when you start to get reciprocal opening, that's how you get people to fall in love. And I don't mean just sexual love, philia, right? Agape, reciprocal opening. That's what affords love. I'm glad I got to answer your question, Tim. It's very good to connect with you again, as always.
Thank you, John.
Great. Actually, I think that that's a wonderful spot to bring it to, the cultivation of philosophia, loving, wisdom, energy. Yep. So, John, let me once again thank you for coming here and sharing your knowledge and wisdom with us. It's been great. Deeply enjoyed it, not surprised by it, but deeply moved and enjoyed it tremendously.
Yes, Gregg.
Any kind of final thoughts you want to leave us with as we wrap up here?
Just that this was really wonderful. You could tell I was getting, I won't say passionate because I'm a Stoic, or at least insofar as I'm a Neoplatonist, and so passionate. But I got into very much a flow state, I deeply appreciate the affordance of that. And I found myself articulating things in a way I have not articulated them before, and I always find that very enriching. So thank you for affording that and making it possible and welcoming me here. And I hope that you have found the discussion beneficial.
It's had like a recursive relevance realization.
Almost relational. Almost
in relation.
Yeah.
All right. So with that 4R frame for love and wisdom, we'll bring this to a close. Thank you so much. And we'll keep trying to do our thing. So, all right, guys.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Yep. Peace. Take care.